Hello, everybody. It is 12 noon. Welcome to Tapes and eDiscovery, a foundation for success. A big thank you to everybody who joined us live today. We are also planning to record this presentation and distribute it via email in the next few days. Before we begin, a few introductions. Next slide, please. We have with us Danny Aga. He's Renew Data's Forensic Manager and Senior Client Advisor. We also have Nathan Hudgens, Renew Data's Operations Technical Consultant. Now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Nathan.
Thanks, Kathy. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, I suppose, depending on your geographical location. Thanks for joining us, Danny, as well. Just go over quickly what we're going to cover in today's session. We're going to start with a quick overview of backup tape to make sure that everybody has the same frame for the further sessions. Then we'll get into backup tape's role in electronic discovery, some of the pitfalls that we've seen over the years, and some recommendations and best practices. From there, we'll go into accessing data on the backup tape, start looking at some actual workflows and some project scenarios. Following up with quick discussion around post-discovery options and how to reuse information generated throughout the discovery process for future matters. And finally, question and answer session. We are going to hold the questions until the end. We do have a fairly aggressive curriculum here that we want to get through, but we certainly will follow up with everyone's questions and follow up in email or with phone conversations if necessary. So please shoot those questions out throughout the presentations, and we will consolidate those at the end and get to as many as we can. All right, let's jump right into this. So the first area, we just want to do a quick overview. We have folks from different backgrounds on the call, and I want to make sure that we don't lose anybody off the bat. So a quick overview of backup tape and how data gets to tape. Let's look at a diagram of a simplified backup environment with a kind of traditional layout of using tape as the archiving system. If you start on the left, a couple different server types that are typical for a corporate data center. First, get a file server that stores user documents, typically Excel files, PDF files, Word documents. The idea around a file server is typically that a user's user share is linked to their My Documents folder on their PC or laptop, and files that are generated and modified by the users are either stored or synchronized back to the file server so that the company maintains a consolidated view of all of those user documents. The next server type is an email server. Obviously, this stores all the email communication throughout a corporation. Pretty straightforward. Exchange and Domino servers are the predominant types we see, but there are certainly other types out there. Database and application servers. These are kind of supporting some of the internal applications. They're not typically associated with electronic discovery requests, but they certainly can be depending on the matter. And then finally, a NAS device, network attached storage, a large storage array that just stores any type of data or repository for a corporation. So typically those are networked into a tape library, which actually does the backup to tape. So if we take a look into the tape library, and I just kind of highlighted some specific components here that are important to our discussion. The tape library typically consists of a backup agent and the backup software. That is responsible for actually writing the data to tape, reporting on the status of that backup, tracking the files and file list information for that backup, the session dates, that type of thing. You have a controller which actually grabs the tapes from a storage location, inserts them into a set of tape drives that reside within the library, and once the backup is complete, the tapes are moved back into the storage, the offline storage area. You'll notice that the arrow between the tape drives and the tapes goes both ways, and I wanted to represent the fact that tapes can be reused within a tape library in a backup configuration, specifically for an example of daily backups. over a month period, a corporation may choose to reuse the daily backups so that they minimize the number of tapes in their library. A couple of key components that we'll talk about: backup frequency, daily backups, weekly backups, monthly backups, just determining the schedule of when a backup is run. That's basically what we're touching on there. And backup type, full versus incremental. A full backup is going to back up all the data on a server as it stands that day, versus an incremental, which will only back up new files that have changed since the last backup or since a specified point in time. Typically, we target full backups for use with electronic discovery, but we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides. And then lastly, backup software. There are several different types that you can use. We'll show you a list on the next slide, just understanding that there are different backup softwares which use different formats to write to tape. All right. Moving on, this is just a quick snapshot of some common tape models and backup softwares. We don't need to step through each one of these one by one. I think the major takeaway here is that different tape models can really change the complexity of a discovery project, specifically due to capacity and input and output speeds or read speeds. One quick example, if you look at an LTO6, which is kind of a more modern tape, tape can hold over 6 terabytes of compressed data. If you compare that to a DLT4, which was popular around the turn of the century, that tape can hold roughly 160 DLT4s on one LTO6. And so as you grow in the number of LTO6s and the size of your data center, obviously, if you're dealing with older tapes, you can see how the volume of tapes can quickly increase. That's really the takeaway here. Some of these backup softwares here for the IT folks on the phone, some of these are very common with Backup Exec and Net Backup, and then you also get some fairly rare backup softwares that we've seen over the years that we've built tools for to handle. All right, so the next slide, Danny's going to talk to us a little bit about the role of backup tape in eDiscovery, and I'll hand it over to him.
Thanks, Nate. So let's discuss why backup tape can be a great choice as a source of evidence. Obviously, you have all these servers, you have your desktops and laptops, and sometimes tape can be overlooked. But, you know, when you're talking about evidence, obviously defensibility is a key concern, and tape can address that well in many ways. First, it's a copy of the original data in its native form, so metadata is maintained, and it can't be edited. That's actually attributed to the way tape drives are designed. They write an end of data mark when they're done writing, so future writes can only happen from that spot forward. So basically, you can add new data until it's full, or start over from the beginning, but not edit. There's also a few aspects that make it easy to meet preservation obligations. As Nate said, you know, typically people are doing daily, weekly backups, so you can suspend your recycling procedures because most IT staff is going to reuse tapes on a scheduled basis to fit their backup schedule, but you can just suspend that recycling procedure, put some tapes aside. Other things that make it easy are the fact that they're created through the normal course of business. Full backups are created in most cases at least once a week, if not daily. So it's really a good snapshot in time of an environment. And chain of custody really isn't an issue, first because you can't edit the tapes, and also because movement of tapes is typically logged as they typically go to off-site storage like an Iron Mountain or Recall. So you have paperwork regarding where they are and usually what's on them as well. So what makes it nice from that point forward is any evidence you find, any emails or files that are particularly important are usually auditable back to the tape. The vendors that process tapes have an audit trail, so every container that contains a piece of evidence all the way down to that final file or email is traceable back to the original tape. The findings are repeatable and verifiable because the process to read the data from the tapes is a read-only process, and it's easy to verify findings. And when you're talking about older data, tape may be the only available source, so it's important to understand what your kind of data landscape is, your date ranges for a case, because depending on how far back it goes or the nature of how the data was preserved, you may not realize that you have pertinent information and that is only on tape. And whenever we talk about backup tape, I think a lot of people who don't deal with it often think of it as a very kind of arcane platform. And
certainly hear that a lot in the industry.
Yeah, it's true in a sense. I mean, backup tape has been around for 50 years, but ever since the invention of the hard drive, the tape industry has been kind of trying to defend its position in the storage space. That most common tape type, Nate talked about, the LTO6, it holds 6 terabytes, and a blank tape only costs about $50. So when you consider that ratio of price to performance, as well as the fact that tapes can last 15 to 30 years, that's going to keep tape very relevant as an archive format. In fact, the roadmap of that LTO line of tapes is already planned out to LTO 10. New generations appear every 2 to 3 years, so this isn't something that is going away anytime soon, so it's important to kind of get a grasp of how it may apply to your particular case.
Yeah, you certainly see the capacity in tape and speed starting to surpass traditional disk, and I think that the overall culture is starting to understand that long-term archive is really going to stay on tape for the long term.
Exactly. LTO6 is twice as fast as a traditional hard drive. So, if you've been in eDiscovery for a while as Lit Support Manager, you've probably heard somebody suggest that you should avoid going to tape at all costs because they require a significant amount of IT resources, or you have to go to a third party to restore them. And just the fact that they hold a large amount of data, there's a perception that preserving a large amount will also lead to a large amount of processing expenditure. And I can definitely see why there would be that reticence. And like anything else, people typically fear the unknown. So we just like to educate everyone on the topic and hopefully mitigate some of these fears with some real-world examples of how tape can be beneficial. Burdensome arguments. When I first started, I had to write quite a few affidavits and declarations regarding these.
I think we all did back in the day.
And not so much anymore. I mean, you used to be, 100 tapes, and people would claim, it's going to take a year and $1 million to extract this data. And it's not that people aren't trying to continue to make those arguments, but the odds of winning are pretty low. But we've come down to the point where it's proportionally appropriate for most cases, from a cost perspective. I mean, we as a company, I think we did, 50,000 tapes so far this year. So obviously...
Yeah, that is correct.
That's just to give you an idea of how common tape processing has become. So what I'd suggest, if you already know that potentially relevant data may reside on tape, go ahead and try to address it on your own terms rather than waiting until you're under a deadline. To that end, there are many ways to reasonably assess tape using sampling methodologies, regardless of the number of tapes you may have. And Nate's going to talk about that a little more in his section about workflow.
And one piece on that I'll also throw an additional note is, I think what we've seen from our side is for preservation, there's an expectation that a corporation tracks what's on their backup tapes and has the ability to target specific information. It's not acceptable to go back and kind of throw out that you have 10,000 backup tapes, whether it's from an acquisition of a company or from your own backups, and not have the information available to kind of provide an early case assessment. And so that's really driving a lot more actual work into the backup tape area as opposed to kind of, as Danny mentioned, going through those burdensome arguments.
So this first scenario is basically what you're typically going to run into most commonly. It's discovery or early case assessment involving recent email and file server data, things that are in your live environment. And early case assessment is basically risk analysis, trying to see what your exposure is in a case, whether you want to settle, whether you, it's kind of very similar to discovery, but for your own benefit rather than opposing. So typically what happens when you have this need, you contact a forensics guy like me to collect forensic images of relevant custodians' laptops and desktops. You may also have someone collect email data and file data if you know what's relevant early on. You may have your IT staff, or you could be big enough to have an eDiscovery staff that handles self-collection of that data. So I just want to present tape as another option in that scenario. One, as we discussed, it's very quick to accomplish, even if you want to create a specific backup for your particular matter that only has, certain departmental shares and certain users' data. Tape is designed to back up large amounts of data very quickly and in an immutable container. So it's quick, it's very unobtrusive because it's your actual IT staff that's doing it. It's part of their daily operations. You don't have somebody else's hands on the keyboard. The other thing I like about grabbing entire servers at the beginning is you substantially reduce your risk of having to recollect and pay for recollection and explain why things were missed in the first place. And that leads to more flexibility as well, because early on in the case, you're probably not going to have a finite list of custodians and areas to search. You may have not even started doing your custodian interviews yet. So if you have the entire email server and the entire file server, you can browse through, say, file listings of that data. You may notice that, IT has this stash of, terminated employee PSTs that you were unaware of. And it's just gives you a visibility to your entire landscape of data. And it can certainly be cheaper because, like Nate said, if you can stick 6 terabytes on a tape, you may be able to grab all the server information you need on a single tape. Better providers out there are only going to charge you per tape and not per gigabyte to get to that data. And then you can just whittle that down however you'd like to the same set of data that you would have had if you had a magic wand at the beginning with, just your specific custodians and folders that you needed. But you were able to preserve everything, and then moving forward down through processing and everything else, it's the same amount of data.
Yeah, and I'll certainly add on to that from the perspective of getting a tape and sending it to a service provider. You're kind of relying on their expertise. Once they have the tape in-house, they can really start to slice and dice and consult with your IT team, as Danny mentioned, without being obtrusive and being on site and having to disrupt other folks' days. So it definitely helps during the ECA process, and it really gives you some consultative add-on there when you do use tape.
So the second scenario is a similar situation, except the data that you're looking for is not on your live system. It's either older, or it could be something that you acquired through a merger and acquisition. So it's not there readily accessible by your IT staff. And any local sources you might have, like individual people's machines, user directories, maybe an incomplete picture. Machines get repurposed and retired, so it's unlikely it's going to be a full snapshot of what you need. And as we discussed earlier, a tape backup from December 1st, 2007 is going to have a complete snapshot of all the files that were present at that time. So it's good to pare down specific date ranges, and you can feel confident that you have everything that you may potentially need. So once you get to that point that you know the tapes are going to be relevant for your case, there are two options then, and that's native and non-native restoration. And native is what Nate showed earlier, all of those backup software types that were used to create the tapes. That's considered native backup software. And non-native, if we go on to the next slide, that's going to be what most third parties use. So when you talk about native software, that's typically why burdensome arguments aren't completely disingenuous. I mean, if you think about a backup administrator's job, the whole environment and everything is geared around performing backups, making sure they're done completely and correctly and they finish during the backup window so business operations can continue. There's very few scenarios that a backup administrator runs into where they would have to do complete restores, especially restores of many different points in time, like you would in eDiscovery scenario. It's typically, something was deleted off one server, it's just a single point in time that may need to be restored to get something very specific. So if you're talking about IT restoring tapes, it is quite burdensome to recreate that environment of hardware and software, especially since most companies are going to refresh that hardware and software, usually every 3 or 4 years. And if they go to a different type of tape, completely different software, they may not be equipped to handle any of their legacy tapes. And the way these libraries are set up, it's usually like a 50-to-1 ratio of tape slots to tape drives. So even a company that has created many tapes isn't going to be able to restore them in nearly as scalable fashion as vendors like us who can throw 100 drives at a time at a group of tapes. And so the way that non-native restoration works is basically reverse engineering. It gets rid of all of those above obstacles, and basically what happens is we kind of look at the data from a data recovery standpoint. We see what's on the tape. We kind of remove those wrappers that the backup software puts on there and have technology to do things in parallel fashion, so that greatly increases speed. There's a lot of automation involved, which reduces cost, and it's a more defensible process because it's a disinterested third party. It's tools and procedures that have been vetted across thousands of jobs, and that's kind of the advantage.
And to underscore, the value of non-native processing, and typically you will see that most service providers that can scale do use non-native technology. And the idea is similar to what Danny said. If you rely on native setups and native configurations, you kind of have to have tape drives and software set up for each restore. Within a data center of a service provider, we can set up hundreds of pods where we don't need to order the tapes in a tape set. We don't need to worry about the backup software. We have tape types that span back several decades, and tape drives. And so we have an environment set up to where we can quickly start parallel processing and push those tapes out. Even if you have a 10-tape set, from one backup, we can process all 10 tapes at one time. And so it really just helps you get to the data faster, puts you in a better position when you're assessing the state of your case and the amount of data and what you're going after. And in most cases, that's really your only approach if there's a large volume of tapes. Right.
Okay, so back to the legal side of things. What's your worst case scenario when you think about producing evidence? It's usually that opposing has evidence that you should have produced or you did have, but for some reason did not. It's kind of like the Zuba Lake case is a good example. So I think there's a lot of misconception that tape is commoditized, especially tape extraction, tape restoration, and just want to kind of clear up some myths there. First of all, the native software is not necessarily going to be the gold standard. You would think the software that created the tape would be the best option to get the data off, but like every other type of backup software, there are software bugs. There's different service packs and updates and compatibility with newer and older versions. There are features that are applied like tape expiration dates and access passwords that could cause the native restoration to not be able to access data that could be readily accessed otherwise. The native software typically relies on a catalog, and we've seen many instances where the catalog is incomplete or corrupt. I mean, we've even done jobs specifically because a company's catalog got corrupt, couldn't be restored, and they had no idea what was on their tapes anymore.
Absolutely.
So it's not necessarily the best option in all scenarios. And the other misconception is that all non-native restorations are the same. You think any kind of commoditized business, you think like you call a plumber, you have an issue, whoever you call is going to fix that the same way. But in fact, it really couldn't be more different because there's so much reverse engineering involved. You're going to be limited to the different data that any particular non-native software has seen in order to be able to code against and address every possible type of data combination. So a good example of that, just about a year ago, we processed tapes 1 month apart from another major vendor for a very large company. We're talking about 10,000 plus employees, and we ended up finding 30% more custodians than the backup from the previous month. So, how does that happen? And in my opinion, I think it has to do a lot with the exception bucket. And by exception, I mean anything that would cause a file or email to not be produced. So with some providers, you have requirements such as, the tapes need to be processed in a specific order, or the set needs to be complete, or they rely on backup software catalog information. So in those cases, anything that a provider classifies as the requirements for full restoration, if you don't have that for whatever reason, there's a tape missing or a tape is corrupt, you could be putting terabytes of data in an exception bucket that could be readily accessible by another provider's technology. And unfortunately, what we see is, people don't realize that or know what questions to ask until they're in one of these scenarios where they're obviously missing a lot of data. So it's important to ask those kind of questions beforehand about error handling, about how many tapes have you seen, how do you handle physically damaged and corrupt tapes, things like that, so you have the highest level of confidence that as much data as can possibly be restored from your set of tapes is actually restored from your tapes.
Yeah, I'll touch a little bit here on email retention policies and how that plays in. I think the takeaway from this one is certain email systems have the ability to set retention policies specifically on deleted items. So, for example, if you have an Exchange environment, you can set the deleted items or dumpster items retention range from 14 days to 30 days. And so that even if a user deletes an email while they're working in Outlook, that email is still stored on the Exchange server for up to that time period that was configured. And the most common, as I mentioned, are 14 days and 31 days. And so understanding what that retention policy is on your server and then marrying that with your approach on frequency and what tapes you're going to restore can be an important piece. For instance, if your retention policy is 2 weeks, a good approach would be to target weekly backups because you would guarantee to have all the deleted items across each weekly backup.
And to touch a little bit more on that also assumes that your provider is processing that dumpster data. Some may not be doing that by default. So that's another scenario where there could be pertinent emails, especially when you're talking about recently deleted emails that may be pertinent to your case. And depending on the approach the provider uses, those may not show up.
That is very true, and we are often called in to analyze and assess other providers' results, and that is something that is a common theme. So that's a very good point. User-initiated archives. This is another just a gotcha to watch out for. Depending on the email system configuration, users can sometimes initiate offline archives from Outlook. And so if you initiate an archive, those messages being pushed to that PST, depending on the configuration on the Exchange server, can be removed from the Exchange server because now the live copy of that message is on the user's within the user's My Documents folder in a offline PST. And so understanding that going in, and obviously it depends on the scope of the discovery and what you're trying to get after and the configuration of the email server, all those kind of play in during the consulting process and the ECA process. But I just wanted to throw that out there as something to be aware of. All right.
All right. So I just wanted to go over some anecdotes about situations that didn't go particularly well in just to give you guys some warnings on what to look out for. So the first case was quite a few years ago. It's basically a pretty technically unsavvy lawyer. He made an agreement with the other side to do all eDiscovery processing, tape work, processing to review at opposing's offices. That on the surface, if you're not in the industry, what's wrong with that? All the data was created there. What's the big deal? But the problem is, most eDiscovery providers have an entire data center and workflow and automation and some heavy-duty servers designed to quickly, efficiently cut through large amounts of data very quickly. So when you're trying to do all of that on site, you lose so much of that efficiency. You're incurring travel costs and shipping costs, and it just underscores the point that, especially when it comes to tape, to go ahead and try to leverage the experience of people that kind of do it on a regular basis, get some advice before you commit to anything that's going to potentially lead to significant cost overruns throughout your case.
Yeah, and certainly relying on individuals that have experience and have defensible workflows, you're certainly managing the risk on your side as well by using defensible processes and being able to use them within court for testimony or affidavits if needed, as opposed to handling that all in-house and kind of taking on all the risk of missing a tape or your workflow not being sound. That's certainly something we see a lot of, that offloading of that risk.
Yeah, especially if you're using black box technology that you're not really sure what it's doing. Okay, so another scenario, or actually another experience I had was regarding a federal agency. It was across the street from the White House. They had very high security concerns because they were involved in a pretty high-profile case, and they needed data right away. They had about a dozen tapes that needed to be done in-house. They said they just couldn't leave their facility because they were just too worried about security. So I went out there with a developer of ours, and we did the work all over a weekend and got them what they needed. It was probably a little more expensive than had they been able to provide the tapes to us, but government agency and budgets, the next time around they decided, well, okay, we'll courier the tapes over to your facility and we're going to keep eyes on the tapes, and that's how we'll employ security the second time around. And they did that, and then they toured our facility and realized that our security was well above and beyond their government facility. And then the third time they used us, they just FedExed the tapes because it wasn't even close as far as the physical and network security we have. So that's something people really don't understand, just how wide the spectrum is of security when it comes to electronic discovery and tape vendors. This is your data. You wouldn't send off all your data to a place like Iron Mountain or Recall without kind of having an idea of how they secured things and what their procedures are. And so if you're going to develop a relationship with somebody, I highly encourage you to actually visit that provider, see how they deal with security, especially since, I just see, stories all the time about data being lost and the huge financial impacts corporations have when they lose something.
It seems like every day we're reading about another data breach and the effects that has on both the corporation and obviously stock prices.
Right. So obviously security is a concern to everybody. It was obviously a huge concern to this federal agency, but they could have probably done things a little easier, a little cheaper by just validating what their needs were. Final scenario is kind of a tough deal. We were approached by an extremely large financial services institution regarding what seemed to me to be probably 2 or 3 times the size of the largest tape job I had ever seen undertaken. It was like over 200,000 tapes. And they were really ambitious. They wanted to get all those tapes processed in 18 months. And I just didn't think that was feasible. On top of that, they wanted it all done in a data center that they were going to create just for this process. And I definitely didn't think that would be feasible. I mean, if we were doing it in our data center with all this automation and the 24-hour staff and things like that, it could have been accomplished, probably not in 18 months, but I felt like we could probably do something there. But, because of their on-site requirements, we had to bow out, and I figured they would probably just, kind of rethink that whole endeavor. And then 4 years later, I find out that somebody did agree to try to take that project on for them, and they were about, I think, a third or less of the way done after 4 years. And obviously, the cost overruns and the time frame overruns were just horrific. And that's just a case of a combination of the first point, leverage the experience of people who do it daily. You may have an idea of what your expectations are, but if they're not realistic, they're not realistic. So maybe somebody can provide a more tailored solution to get you what you need in a verifiable and achievable time frame. There's always going to be somebody that says, yeah, sure, we'll give it a shot, and then you don't want to be in that situation where you've so overblown your budget and your time frame to where you wish you hadn't run into that vendor going forward.
Absolutely. All right, thanks, Danny. All right, next we're going to get into a little bit of analyzing the data on tape, talking about some specific workflows after you've already received a discovery request and you're kind of getting into it. So the first slide, and this is really probably the most important slide in this deck, is be prepared. And we've touched on this throughout some of the previous slides. I cannot underscore enough. Being prepared for litigation as it relates to data in a corporate data center and where that data resides is paramount to staying ahead and staying in a good legal position. As many of you are aware, I think a very uncomfortable position to be in is receiving a large discovery order that crosses multiple years and not having the information to understand where that data lives. And you find yourself with tens of thousands of backup tapes or multiple disk or whatever archive types are utilized by that corporation, and you're in a very difficult position to even object to the discovery order because you don't have that baseline information. And so some of those items that can help put a corporation in good standing, and talking a little bit about information governance, data mapping, understanding where the data lives, understanding what data exists on what media format is very important. Tape inventory, as we've discussed, if a IT department or storage vendor already has a catalog, that will help you get to the target tapes very quickly, as opposed to having to send someone all of your tapes because you can't handle them in-house, and you kind of need to recreate that catalog information. Another one is understanding regulatory requirements. Obviously, in different sectors, there are different regulatory requirements around the archiving of data and how long that data must stay on tape. I know in the finance sector, we've typically seen a 7-year period where data has to be stored on archive, and even longer in some cases. So understanding what that requirement is will help you define your data expiration policies and your data deletion policies. Legal hold, obvious, this one probably everyone is comfortable with. As data is responsive to ongoing matters, it must be locked down, can't be deleted until the case is finalized. And so understanding how to place data on legal hold within the data center, and also how to and when to release it. Kind of segueing into the next item, I think probably the most consistent issue we see with corporations' information governance policies are around the deletion and the expiration of data. You may have good policies in place to place data on legal hold. You understand where your data is. You understand what your backups contain. But if you don't have a policy and procedure to delete that data once it falls out of legal hold, you're now maintaining a library of thousands or tens of thousands of tapes. And in the worst case scenario, some of those tapes are called into question, and because of unfavorable rulings, you may now be responsible for processing those tapes, even though you really had no regulatory requirement or legal requirement to keep them. And so that's really a situation that you want to try to stay away from, and we've seen some fairly nasty projects in the past come from that type of situation. And all that really ties up into a litigation readiness plan. Just having everyone in the corporation understand how to react to litigation, where to go, what the process is to search for data, how to pull that data, having roles defined. That's just really paramount. I just can't stress that enough. And again, just touching on the risk, all of this helps to improve your legal position from start to finish, minimize data. You no longer have to keep that data past its retention policies, and ultimately reduce costs. Because simply put, processing one tape is less expensive than processing 10,000 tapes. That's really the simplest way I can put it. Obviously, there are complexities in there, but if you can cull that down on your side, it will definitely help. Okay, next, we're going to talk about kind of the first steps once you receive a discovery order or some kind of request on data. What is that? What the thought process is, and what does that start to look like? Really, the first question from the technology side you really want to ask is, again, does the IT or storage vendor possess an existing catalog? We've touched on this several times. You really want to be in a position where you have some idea of the tapes. If not, it's not the end of the world. There are service providers out there like Renew Data that can help scan thousands of tapes in a accepted or amount of time, I'll say with quotes. And those catalogs will often contain the tape count, model, backup software, the backup dates to track when that data was written to tape and when that snapshot was taken, the specific servers, whether it's an email server, whether it's a loose file server, the platform types, just to provide additional targeting information. All of that obviously helps to do a quick analysis up front when you receive a discovery order. And then obviously identify the scope of discovery. This one is fairly standard whether you're talking about backup tape or not. In the forensics collection world, common practice is not to, and Danny could speak to this, going out into the field and collecting all of the data on an Exchange server for all users, because you haven't done the legwork to understand what type of data is responsive to this case, what type of data are potentially responsive, and what the scope of the matter is. And so culling that down by having meet and confer sessions, understanding what custodians are in question, what types of data, what potential user shares or department shares may be in question, and the date ranges, having that still applies to backup tape type discovery, because we can apply that information prior to restoration and help target tape sets. So let's take a look at a couple sample projects. Time permitting, we can get through these. First sample project, financial institution. This is a situation where, and these are based on real projects, we had 14,000 backup tapes. Really, this one was due to an acquisition of a fairly large company, and so the acquiring company ended up with just bins and bins of backup tapes with really no idea what was on the tapes and no access to the IT personnel who created the tapes. And they were kind of in hot water over the inability to respond to discovery requests over these tapes. And so they were being pushed to kind of create larger catalogs and understand what was on the tapes. The specific request surrounded only 20 custodians, but across those entire set of backup tapes, which had no catalogs. Email communication spanning a 3-year date range. And so the next slide, I'll kind of walk through how we approached dealing with those 14,000 tapes and what we delivered back. You'll also notice on the bottom here, I noted post-discovery options. It doesn't end with the end of the discovery process, right? There's information generated, a catalog, for instance, that can be reused for future litigation and to minimize or to streamline future litigation. And so I'll talk a little bit, I'll touch on how we provide additional information kind of at the end of a project. So for this project, the sample workflow, the first the first step is always going to be chain of custody, which is a physical inventory of the tapes. We're going to look at the tapes. Once we receive them in Austin, we're going to look for physical damage. If there is damage on a tape, we're going to take a picture of it. We're going to note the serial number and the tape number, and we're going to provide that back to the client just so that there's tracking throughout the process and that's fully documented. Also, we're recording the serial numbers and any user-specific notes on the tapes into our media tracking system. And all of that is fully auditable and reported at the completion of chain of custody. And so at that point, specifically on large tape volumes like this, the company typically doesn't even know the types of tapes and the years the tapes were created, what type of backup software. So we kind of start to catalog that here and provide them back a full chain of custody report so that they know what they're dealing with. The next step is to do a high-level or top-level scan of the tapes to pull out, again, like we've talked about, the session information, the date the session was created, the backup software used, the file listing information with full path and file, some user information that we can use to target, and the dates. All of that will be available after a scan, which when we get into the next box, analyze catalog information, we start to look at the actual breakdown of the information in those session reports. So in this specific case, we were able to scan through the 14,000 tapes in, I believe it was 6 weeks. We started to look at the catalog information and realized that the date range in question only crossed about 2,000 of the tapes. And so immediately we identified those 2,000 tapes as kind of the target set, and we're able to set apart the other 12,000 tapes at that point. From there, before we started restoration, we targeted for user mailboxes and found which tapes actually contained user mailboxes. And then at that point, we flagged those for restoration, and we went and we would restore the target mailboxes. These were Lotus Notes files in this situation from a Domino server. So at that point, we've now kind of traversed through 14,000 tapes, and now we've kind of end up with only the target user mailboxes from those tapes for the time periods that are relevant. And so we've kind of traversed through, without too much heavy lifting, down to the actual target data. From that point, we do duplicate across the target mailboxes. This is a really important part of backup tape processing because as you talk about backups, you're backing up the same data over and over again. And so it's highly duplicative. Every week, you're backing up the server, which has a lot of the same information. And so deduping across each backup set per custodian so that you have a unique view of that custodian's mailbox representative of the entire date range of backups is really an important part of the workflow. So we dedupe. At that point, we had a unique set of NSF files for each user. We sent that back to the client. They wanted to do some internal processing and analysis of those files, so we just sent the raw NSFs back. And we also provided the catalogs we had created because they had been in hot water about targeting these tapes. They wanted to have the catalog on site so that they could analyze the content of what they have and where it applied in other situations. And so we delivered the catalog information back as well. Now, going back to the post-discovery options, one of the things we realized is that these tapes spanned quite a number of years. And after analyzing the content of the session information and then working with their corporate and legal teams, we determined that roughly 6,000 of the tapes didn't need to be held because of regulatory requirements or legal holds. And so after some back and forth between the teams, we were actually able to provide certified destruction of those tapes and remove those from their footprint. So that saves on storage costs. It reduces risk of having to access those tapes in the future, and just a whole number of options for them were kind of provided for that service. So definitely something that we do quite often. Okay, let's jump into a quick, let's see, we have 10 minutes, so let's run through this one fairly quickly. Sample Project 2, this was a large technology company, 2,000 LTO backup tapes. Again, they did not have really strong catalogs on these tapes. There were 124 custodians. They were targeting email and loose documents over a 2-year date range. And post-discovery, we actually migrated all the data on tape into their existing archive, which has since supplanted their backup tape environment as their midterm archive solution. And then we also destroyed the tapes. And so let me walk you through what that looks like here. So you'll kind of see here the first 4 boxes are very similar to the previous workflow. Chain of custody, physical inventory, do a high-level scan of the tapes, analyzing the catalog information from those tapes. In this case, we identified which tapes contained exchange information. We identified which tapes contained the user share information that they were going after. And we also identified which tapes fell within the backup tape range. So after identifying that information up front, we were able to mark those tapes for targeted restore. We restored that information, got into the eDiscovery workflow, I'll call it, and we get into back to the deduplication and culling of target mailboxes and user shares. And so at this point, we're only going after the information relevant to that discovery request, culling it down based on dates, deduping the files, and then processing that data into a processing tool. I kept this box fairly simple, but obviously there's a lot more to this box, but for the purposes of this meeting, I left those out. But certainly there are analytics going on there. There are keyword searching, email threading, a lot of things that we provided for the client prior to review. And then we loaded all of that into our hosted review platform, which is Relativity. Now, once the eDiscovery process was done, we actually came back and did another workflow for entire migration. They recognized that these tapes, they didn't want to hold on to these tapes anymore. They had since stood up an archiving environment on disk that was maintaining all of their information kind of in a live environment. And so what we did is we actually went back and converted all mailboxes across their Exchange environment. We converted and deduped all user shares across all their user share environments so that they had a unique set of email and user share data across all these 2,000 tapes. And we sent that back to them in a format that they easily loaded back into their vault. And so at that point, their vault is now back up to date, and they no longer need to keep these tapes. So we actually went through, we destroyed the tapes and delivered all of the data back to them in that format for archiving. So hopefully that wasn't too much. I know that was long-winded. Thank you for staying with me. Let's see. Let's jump on to the next example. This one really quickly, this is just a simple project, and I wanted to show that if you do have good information policies in place, it really can save on the complexity and time of a project. In this situation, we're dealing with a healthcare organization that actually did have fairly solid information governance policies and procedures. They were tracking what tapes were where, what custodians were on each tape, the servers those custodians belonged on, where the user shares were, and the dates. So they, on the IT side, they were able to target the relevant tapes before sending those to renew data. And so instead of thousands of tapes, we received 52 LTO4 tapes. 8 custodians and a shared department directory that they were going after, again, email and loose documents, and a 6-month date range. So obviously the takeaway here is that if you're tracking the information on the corporate side, you really can cull down on the amount of effort that goes into the eDiscovery process and the cost and timeline associated. And so in this case, we went from thousands of tapes to 52, and we were able to turn this project around in a week or two. So this one, and I'm going to just skip over this because it's very similar to the other projects, but very simply, chain of custody, restoring exchange data, converting the target mailboxes, targeting the user shares, and then deduping that and returning it to the client. Very straightforward, very easy project. It just shows what good information governance can do. Okay, so to finalize here, we have about 5 minutes left. Just want to go over the post-discovery options that we touched on. Once you've processed those tapes and you've targeted the information and you've pushed that through and started your attorneys on reviewing the data within a hosted review platform or whatever your approach may be, you can actually reuse a lot of the information, as we talked about. And so some of the situations are migrating that data into a new or existing archive. We talked about the situation where you prep the data for loading into a corporate size archive and then destroying the tapes so that you actually have all the data in an archive. You can actually, we have options here at Renew where you can load it into a hosted archive on our side, whether it's externally available for the client to search, or it's internally hosted and we actually can perform searches and culling at any point during any matter, any future matter. Or we can load it into a true eDiscovery hosted archive like a Relativity, that kind of, if the data is highly litigious. So a couple of options there. Retaining catalog information with cold storage, obviously we can return the catalog information and then the corporate side can store the tapes for long term and they can use that to target the information on their side. And the certified destruction of tapes, which we talked about. You have anything you want to add to that, Danny?
No, I think that last part regarding the archives is very important because you basically don't want to have to extract the same tapes multiple times. So data reuse is really an important aspect since you've kind of gone through the effort to whittle it down to a deduplicated set of data for a specific time frame. It's usually advisable if you have an archive to load that data in there, especially if it's executives or you're in a very litigious industry, because you can kind of just play the odds on whether you're going to need that data again, but it should be a lot cheaper to just go ahead and ingest it than to try to, do a large tape project every time data is encountered that could be on tape. So,
absolutely. All right, so that sums up today's session. Let's take a look at some questions and see if we can answer as many as we can get through over the next couple of minutes. Apologies, I kind of had the assumption that we would run fairly late, but we will certainly follow up with all your questions, and please do submit those. Let's see. Okay, so here's a question regarding basically how project management works around a tape project. So that's a very good question, and I realize now that I did kind of skip over that while we were pushing through the tape workflows. Project managers are assigned at the outset of a project, and so prior to tapes arriving at a Renew facility, we would assign a project manager to do upfront consulting and also a consultant such as myself or a Danny to kind of get in and talk about what backup sources and what tapes you have and help design a workflow. We certainly want to get out ahead of any kind of project in any case possible. And so there will be several conversations, even on-site visits if needed. And then there will be a project manager that walks you through and provides status updates throughout the project, number of tapes that we've processed, providing reports, scheduling communication, and throughout the process all the way to review.
And that's really important from these scenarios where you're trying to reduce the number of tapes you have, because even if we can provide file listings on thousands of tapes, who's going to go through thousands of million-line spreadsheets, right? So our project managers are very consultative. We have internal tools that can help kind of, you give us the idea of what you're looking for from a legal perspective, and then we can apply our analysis to the reports we generate without having to have you go through it all.
Our project managers are really top-notch. One more question before I think we can squeeze in one more. How do we handle, okay, so basically, what do we do when we encounter a corrupt or damaged tape? Danny, you want to take that one?
Sure. There's a few kinds. I mean, physically corrupt, we'll catch that when we do our chain of custody and label all the tapes, and Nate already mentioned that. If it's illogically corrupt, like there's a spot on the tape that can't be read, our standard procedure is to try it in multiple tape drives, because we have, a huge data center with dozens of different types of tape drives, and sometimes the problem is just alignment of the heads. So the tape drive that created it could be just off a little bit, and there may be another drive that's off a little bit that can give you a better chance of getting at that data. And even if we can get only 50% of the way through, our technology can actually extract data up to the spot where things failed, so you can still get as much of the data as possible.
Absolutely. Okay, and with that, we're out of time. I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I hope you took something away from this and you feel a little bit more comfortable with backup tape. And certainly, we will answer all the questions that you submitted, and we are very open to having conversations about upcoming projects or situations that you may currently be in or that you see coming in the future. We're very consultative, and we welcome that opportunity. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, Nathan and Danny. If you'll go one slide next, please. Just a final note to our attendees. Next slide. Perfect. If you have any upcoming tape projects or additional questions, please do send them to inquiries@renewdata.com, and your message will get routed to the right person here. And thanks again for everybody's time today, and please do have a great rest of your day.